Large time. Since we're an intergenerational class.
Yes.
All right. We got a great lesson today, so I want to get to it because there's lots of good stuff to talk about. I'm even going to talk about W.A. Criswell today. So, yeah, get ready for goodness with this. So we've lost a few people due to good things.
Yes.
We've got some folks who are out teaching in children and preschool area with Promotion Sunday. Shannon Gibson being one of them, for sure. And
maybe Maryland.
Maryland.
I didn't see her going.
And Sherry Brooks is teaching.
And Sherry Brooks. Yes. So that's always an excused absence when you're off teaching children. So that's good. And we've got some other folks coming to check us out today. And Dave, is that dial turned all the way to the left?
It needs to be all milk.
Dave. Let me just take a quick look. Make sure we're turned all the way to the left. Yes. All right. Hello over there. Very good. All right. So we're glad to have Bill visiting with us tonight. Ryan. B words. Ryan.
Close, yes.
Yeah. This is Reagan and Casey Brumley, who have been coming for several months to Wilshire, and they've got two youngins, one who just started first grade over at Merriman Park, and glad to have you guys. We go back to Lake Highlands Band Days, which is a great connection indeed. And Rob, would you like to introduce?
So I guess Katie Kruger.
Katie.
We're having a baby in October due to Halloween, so
Yeah.
I have two babies in here.
All right. We're a great class for pregnant women, so we're in the right place.
Don't drink the water.
And for not pregnant women.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Amy and John, we'll find you a place.
Here, there's one.
Well,
We can
and they're waiting
turn a chair.
Here.
Here.
Look.
Look at this. Let's put these together.
I'm worried we might get pregnant.
Yeah, there may be something in that chair. I don't know. Okay, is anyone else here for the first time? I think everyone else has been here before. So glad you're here. If you're not familiar with our pattern, we do our prayer concerns at the end because we're live streaming. And so hello to everyone who's joining us, and glad you're here. We are working our way through the little book of Titus. This is the last of our little epistles that we've been working on, and I'm very excited about today's lesson because it's got some really good stuff in it, if I say so myself. Including a great quote from W.A. Criswell. All right, so last week we began the little book of Titus, and we talked about, and this is, by the way, if you can't find it, it's not all the way to the back, but it's way in the back. Go to Hebrews, and it's adjacent to that. You can find it. So last week we talked about Titus and who he is and what we don't know about him. And all of that. We talked about all of the introduction, and we dug down into that. So today we're going to cover verses 5 through 9 out of the first chapter of Titus. Would someone volunteer to read those verses 5 through 9? Julie?
This is why I left you in Crete, that you might amend what was defective, and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. If any man is blameless, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers, and not open to the charge of being profligate or insubordinate. And I don't know if I pronounced that right. For a bishop, thank you. Would you repeat it the right way?
I will. You're fine.
Thank you. For a bishop as God's steward must be blameless. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered, or a drunkard, or violent, or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of goodness, master of himself, upright, holy, and self-controlled. He must hold firm to the sure word as taught, so that he might be able to give instruction in sound doctrine, and also to confute those who contradict it.
All right, so our goal today is to make sure that you don't kick me out as your teacher for not measuring up to the list given in Titus chapter 1. So I'm going to contort this to be a positive description of myself. You're not laughing. We got a problem. All right. So what we see here is that Paul is writing to Titus and telling him that he left him behind in Crete to do a thing. And this is very similar to what we see that Paul has done with Timothy in Ephesus. We can, if you want to compare, in 1 Timothy 1:3, we have a very similar description where Paul says to Timothy, I urge you, as I did when I was on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus so that you may instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine and to not occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies and so forth. So what Paul has done here is he has taken these young disciples of his and he's put them out in these new outposts, and he is encouraging them to then set up really a more formal organization. So he's charging Titus, the NRSV says, to put in order these churches. So it really means to set straight, to be in the right order of things, just as that says, and to appoint elders. Now here's a fascinating first little conversation for us. This word elders gets translated different ways. And it is a word that even within this passage, we have a reference to elders and we have a reference to bishops. And let's just pause for a moment and ask, how have you known these words, elder and bishop? There's also another word that's used here called overseer within a church. How have you known these words to be used in other church traditions where you've come from? Donna?
Well, I'm not stepping on the good folks over there, but in the United Methodist tradition, an elder is an ordained minister, fully ordained, not a deacon, who is also a minister, but is a full ordained, just like George, would be
Yes.
called an elder. Also in I believe the Church of Christ, I don't know if we have former Church of Christ here, they also call their deacons or elders. And then what I've noticed, some of the Baptist churches that are not that are very traditional, let's just say, on the order of fundamentalists, the movement there is going toward elders. As non-denominational Bible churches, you have elders.
That's right.
So
That's well said. Yeah, and just a parallel passage that we're going to look at in a minute is also from 1 Timothy, where there's a parallel list of qualifications given for deacons. And so there's yet another word that's in here. Kathy?
A bishop is someone you hope doesn't call you on the phone.
Did you hear that? Kathy says a bishop is someone you hope doesn't call you on the phone. Marilyn?
Lutherans also use the term elders.
Yes. But what does it mean in the Lutheran Church?
You know, I never really found out. Roger was a Lutheran, so I attended with him a lot when he was alive. But I just associated them to be equal to a deacon I was familiar with.
Oh, right.
Dwight is an elder, actually.
An elder.
Disciples of Christ.
Christ.
Disciples of Christ.
Yes. So what does that mean in that?
It's actually just leaders of the deacons.
So it would be a part of the deacon ministry.
Right.
Yeah, Mike?
In the Presbyterian, you had two bodies. You had the deacons, and then you had the elders, and the elders were considered the top of the mark, and they were the overseers.
Right. So see how you use both of those words that are used here? Elder and overseer. And the word presbytery that the Presbyterians use actually comes from this as well.
Mark, in Paul's time, the word elder, the position of an elder, held a great deal of respect and authority
Yes.
that we don't see today.
Yes. So what was an elder in the early church? Who was an elder? What did it mean? We don't really fully understand that. And so here's an interesting question for you as well. There are these words that seem to have some specific meaning. And a lot of times we hear people say, well, if we want to really return to the true early church model, we need to use the same words, which the notion of having an elders as a governing body that's very prominent in Bible churches and non-denominational churches, that is now seeped into some Baptist churches as well, is an attempt to sort of go back to this model. One of the questions we need to discuss is whatever these categories are, as they're given in Titus and 1 Timothy and other places in the New Testament, were those intended to be specific job titles for all time? Or were they something for the early church to help them in their particular case? And how do we see the progression of leadership roles in the church over time? What do you think?
Now, when you ask the question about all the time, and you talk about 2,000 years ago, good grief. Your definition of all time is pretty broad.
Yeah, thank you for noticing that.
A lot of things could change.
Linda?
Okay, well, so at some point, the Catholic Church came up with the idea of the Pope and the hierarchy there.
Yeah.
Which are
You got
really
bishops and
not
archbishops
there.
and
Cardinals.
popes and cardinals and
All of that was not.
That's not here.
The Bible.
right? But neither is a minister of missions or a minister of music or a minister of education,
That's right.
which is not to equate any of those with the Pope, by the way.
I
Harry?
wrote a King James version this morning, and it refers to them as aged men and younger men.
Yeah, so now you're getting to the root of
Yes.
this.
And he has a message for the two categories, both men and women, and I do not like the part of the women.
We're going to talk about that. Yeah, we're going to talk about Donna.
Then you also have some ministers that self-proclaim themselves as bishops, not in even their denomination. T.D. Jakes. Just throwing the name out.
Yeah, no, it's very easy to call yourself a bishop. Right? I've been thinking about it, but I'm not sure.
Still on the
It doesn't quite have the
fence.
right ring to it. Yeah. I think I need some, like potentate. I don't know.
Well, like in the Catholic Church, the names that Linton mentioned, like cardinals, so they could be only in certain churches too. I mean, it denoted a cathedral.
Right, it's a
just
specific assignment, but it's also very hierarchical.
Right,
Yes.
right, very.
Yeah. So, good point.
The
Yeah.
Living Bible refers to them as pastors.
And here is an interesting point, because the term we use as pastor today really derives in a very similar line from this. And the truth is, in the New Testament, there are various words that are used for leaders in the church at different places in different ways. And what I want to say is it's probably okay, right? Because as the church has grown and moved forward, there are different needs and there are different ways of approaching this. And so we've adapted. But guess what? The early church also adapted based upon, remember, Christianity started in Judaism, based upon the roles that were found within Judaism. And so there were all sorts of roles there that got adapted coming into the early church. Let me talk about the purpose of this. So here's my Tom Wright quote for the day. If the pilot is lost, the whole plane is in trouble.
Amen.
Yeah, that's a good quote, right? It's not quite as good as my favorite quote of all time. When the horse is dead, dismount. That was my favorite quote of all time. Yes.
If you're going through hell, keep going.
If you're going to hell, keep going. Yeah. All right. So Tom Wright says if the pilot is lost, the whole plane is in trouble. And so what he's saying here is that Paul is using Titus to find leaders in the church, whatever you want to call them, who will be able to pilot the plane to keep it afloat. Because you've got to have the right people in the right place. They need to know what they're doing, and because this is an upstart religion, they're going to be scrutinized. They need to be exemplary followers of Christ here. Now, from the venerable Wikipedia, some good comments here. An elder in Christianity is a person who's valued for wisdom and holds a position of responsibility, and this is true throughout Christian traditions, all right? We talked about all that. Okay. There's technically a distinction between the idea of ordained elders and lay elders in different religious traditions. Elders are mentioned in a number of New Testament passages. So James, for example, had a significant role in the Jerusalem church and the Council of Jerusalem. And then Paul appoints elders in the churches in Antioch, Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. This is a way of organizing, and we have Titus here today. In Acts chapter 20, Paul speaks directly to elders and warns them to be on guard for this. And so in the Old Testament, the root of this is from the older men in a tribe. So this comment earlier is correct. The word has its root in referring to elders, the wise ones. So this was not necessarily in the Jewish world a priestly calling, although it could be. It was sometimes just those elders who had wisdom to lead. So the word in the Old Testament for elders is presbyteros when it gets translated into the New Testament, and that obviously you can hear presbyter out of that as well. So, and the other words that are used to describe various aspects of this position are overseer and shepherd. And so in 1 Peter, these three words are drawn together where he says, "Therefore I exhort the elders among you, shepherd the flock among you, exercising oversight." All three words in one sentence there, all right? Presbyteros, this word, is the most commonly used term for elder in the New Testament, and we talked about its roots there. It's used with regard to the 12 apostles, to the 70 disciples, and to others acting in a specific role. It is used 28 times in the Gospels and in Acts to speak of the Jewish Sanhedrin, and also in the book of Revelation to refer to the redeemed people of God. So it gets a lot of usage here. So our modern words priest or presbyter are derived from this word, all right? Now, it also, in Latin, derives from the word legate, L-E-G-A-T-E, right? And in the ancient classical function was a herald who presented the highest state office and might be a governor of a province. There's a connection there as well. So, here's a question. Must churches today have bishops or elders, as described here, in order to be biblical? We touched on this just a moment ago. What is necessary today to be a biblical church as far as your leadership? What do you think? If I don't declare myself to be a bishop. Someone?
I don't think it seems very important. I mean, I don't see anybody, we don't care.
Someone's got to be the leader, right?
Oh, we have a minister.
Right? Does it matter what you call that, what you call that leader? Probably not.
Well, the administration, you have to have somebody that's other than the pastor.
Paul also, in some of the epistles, talks about the spiritual gifts and the leadership needs and so forth, right?
Teachers of good words. That's a big priority, is teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we're about to get here is a list of qualifications for whoever this person is or persons who are leaders in the church. And I want to remind you that this parallels a list in 1 Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 2. And if you want to flip over to that, let me highlight that. Here, and Paul says to Timothy, and you know this, you've heard this before. Now a bishop must be above reproach, married only once, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, and apt teacher. This is almost word for word the Titus passage. Not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. It is hard to be a pastor and be a lover of money. He must manage his own household well. Thank you for laughing. Keeping his children submissive and respectful. See, these are the very same points that we've just read. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace and the snare of the devil. And then he goes on in this passage in Timothy to say, deacons, likewise, and it gives a similar kind of list here. So in writing to Timothy, he's talking about bishops and he's talking about deacons. So two different things here. Now, as we look at these, when we're given a list like this, it helps to sort of analyze the list. What does it mean, right? But before we do that, the overarching idea that I want to talk about is that we sometimes call these things the gifts and graces for ministry. Church leaders, whether ordained or lay leaders, must demonstrate the gifts of Christian grace as well. And this is a real rub sometimes. One of the most difficult things we have to do in training young clergy is occasionally to say to someone who declares that they've been called by God to be a pastor, we do not see in you the gifts and graces required to be a successful pastor. Now that is a hard conversation, right? How is that any different than the fields in which you work? Or I'm thinking it may not be, where you have people who come and say, I'm called to be a doctor to work with rehab patients, and you have to say, I don't see that you have the bedside manner for that, right? Right? Yeah, someone else, Susan?
Really tough. When I used to teach nursing, you had students who were like A students and got all the academics, but they just didn't have as you said, the ability to be, empathic or have compassion, and that's really tough because they're making straight A's with So
Yeah.
it's hard. It's really hard.
Don't you think there's other areas of ministry that they can work if they're not
Yes.
suitable for what George does or what you do? There's always someplace else to serve.
Well, just like someone with medical training, maybe they need to be a researcher.
Right,
Maybe
or they need to be
they need to not be around
in the
people.
background.
Helen?
I see that a lot in my work. New people come in and some of them pick it up very quickly, and others, we're not the judges of that. The companies that we work for are, but often they'll say, well, what do you think of Susie Q? And I'll say, well, she's not gifted enough to do this, but she's good at that. So it is kind of tough to say. I don't usually say to them personally,
Yeah.
maybe tour guided is not for you, but maybe you can work shuttles or airport arrivals.
Yeah, we've got Harry and then Donna.
Dr. DeCooley, was he the heart surgeon? What was his last name?
DeBakey.
Cooley. Okay, DeBakey is the one who had a terrible bedside manner. I lived in Houston the time they were doing that, but he was an example of the worst possible, but he could do marvelous things on the body, so.
Yeah, Donna?
Well, I think we see that a lot in chaplaincy. I know Gina has seen that, where you go through, a minister comes in we have a specialized training called clinical pastoral education. And some of these young seminarians come in and they want to be a hospital chaplain or to go into some kind of chaplaincy, and they can't cut it. It's not for them. And they would be horrible in the church. Some chaplains I know would not even entertain being a minister in a church.
Right.
I, for one, am one. I've learned over 30 years I had much rather do ministry out in the public than to be on church staff, because I have been on church staff years ago, and it wasn't any fun. Is that right?
Corporate life, you go in on a 90-day
Trial.
that's the word. And then you're eased out. I mean, like that. So but that's what's good about that. Your position is no longer in the company, and so you leave. But that's but that's good for our residents, because they come and see all the things that happen in a day at a church. I mean, some days it's just, well, let's do this, and we have the meetings.
Well, and to that point, our residents, our pastoral residents, sign a contract that says after 6 months there's a review, and it is an in or an out after 6 months. Either you're going to work or you're not going to work. Anna.
This is not a question. It's just an observation, and maybe I'm just too literal. If God really is calling someone to do something, if it's truly a spiritual calling, how can somebody who is truly called not be compassionate or serve a servant leader or whatever? I struggle with that. I mean, I really do, and I question who else. I mean, were you the only one who heard this call? How did you hear this call? I mean, what really makes you think you were called? Sometimes I think it's self-declared, and those are the ones who probably are the ones who are not fitting into what we know that they should be doing.
Yes, so before we get to Pat, that's so true, Anna, and the reality is, not just in ministry, but in almost any job that you can come up with, people sometimes think they are called to that work, and really their mother called them to that work, or their grandfather called them to that work, or they got pressured somehow, or they just misunderstood, or it's like the old joke about psychology majors, right? How many psychology majors need a psychologist themselves, right? It's free therapy, and that happens in the clergy as well, right? So I have to say, in some of those cases, maybe we don't see it, but in many of those cases, there are other factors at play. Having lived in 2 towns with large Baptist seminaries, Fort Worth and Louisville, we have seen the remnants of this, where people end up in seminary and then never leave the town, right? Because they can't get hired anywhere, or they choose not to, right? Maybe they understand their calling differently. It got so difficult at Southwestern when I was there in the 80s that they began asking the home church that was sending someone to seminary had to sign a statement endorsing them, saying, we believe so strongly in this person's calling that if we had an opening and they were available, they're the kind of person we would hire.
That made him think.
Well, they signed it anyway. Pat and then Donna.
Oh, I was going to say a while ago, in the teaching profession, they have the same thing. You have student teachers, and you have to give the report to their college, And so I've had some that I've had to say, their weaknesses are, they need to grow here or do this, whatever. And then I was going to comment too about the calling. I think I was married to a man whose grandmother called him to preach. And then after we divorced, he became a chaplain, but he was a chaplain in a prison system. So I think that fit him better than where he was.
Yeah, that's exactly true, Don.
Well, when I went to Southwestern, I started in '78, but the church had to say, letter of endorsement. But the running joke there, and I hate to say this because it was among the women, most of them went in to get a Master in Religious Education. They don't even call it now, but Master in Religious Education degree. And they nicknamed it, instead of an MRE degree, it was an MRS degree because they went there to find preacher husbands. And I'm sure they're still doing it.
That happens a lot.
This is a little off this topic, but I can't help.
So
We're
what?
talking bishops and deacons, nowhere in here does it say pastors, preachers. Who's going to head this group up? Or did the bishops and elders alternate leading the service?
So that's actually a great question. That's why I made a little to-do about the words at the beginning, because the kind of people that Titus was to find were really, I think, going to function in that kind of way with a multifaceted leadership role in the church. Again, these were small house churches. And so you needed someone to be in charge of that. We think in grand terms of big buildings and all today. And this is why I think sometimes the terminology that's used here is a jumping off point for us today, but can't be entirely descriptive because the entire organizational structure of the institutional church is so different than it was. But it's not that different than Judaism was. So these things sort of connect. Ann?
It's not as prominent today as it used to be, but over the years I've had a couple of friends whose big Catholic families were still very devout. And one of those kids is going to be a priest or a nun. Called or not called, they're going to be a priest or a nun.
Yeah, and this is a real problem in all of our life. I heard a great quote last week from Parker Palmer. Y'all know Parker Palmer? Yeah. He's a Quaker. One of his greatest little books that I highly recommend for everyone is called Let Your Life Speak. And it's about vocation. He's done a lot of work on vocation. And he was, you know the saying, the unexamined life is not worth living? Mm-hmm. Right? Right. He was riffing on that, and he says, that's true, but if you choose to live an unexamined life, at least don't work in any profession that involves relating to people. Because you're going to mess them up. If you're working in any profession that relates to people, you need to live an examined life. Mm-hmm. You need to be thinking about yourself and who you are and how you need to be self-aware, right? So that all of our callings in life, and one of the things we try to teach our youth here at Wilshire, the whole point of the Your Call program that youth go through is not just to call out people for Christian ministry, but to call out people to be Christians in whatever work they undertake in life. We work with youth to try to help them think about, maybe I'm called into ministry, but if I'm not called to be a vocational minister, how can I be a Christian who is a banker? How can I be a Christian who is a nurse? How can I be a Christian who is, and what calling do I have on my life to live out my profession in a way that's going to glorify God?
I'm reading a book right now about the cosmos and astronomy, and it's a book I'm going to suggest to the science club book thing. And the guy in there is a really, really religious person, a Christian, and he is trying to show in the book the very same thing you're talking about in terms of you don't have to be a special person to be a Christian. And he's trying to talk to young people about going into maybe astronomy, because as a child he used to look up at the stars and wonder about God. So he thought he was going to be a preacher, but he turned out to be an astronomer, and now witnesses everywhere.
Beautiful. And what I'm not talking about here is hanging out a ichthus sign on your plumbing shop so people will know that you're a Christian and they'll come give you business, right? I'm not talking about the Christian yellow pages, which I'm opposed to.
I think the world is better served by ourselves as Christians because of our example. One time we lived on a cul-de-sac. And, we had teenagers, so there were cars everywhere and everything else. But we took one car to church. Everyone, before we got introduced to the circle, thought Clifton was the pastor because we went to church every Sunday. I promise that. That's crazy.
All right, I'm going to move this on. One of the things I want to say is when we get to the end of this, which we probably won't get to today, all of this gets summed up. A lot of the things that are in this list are things that were common in the Greco-Roman culture as important attributes. One of the big things that separates this list from a cultural list is the emphasis on refuting false teachers. That would have been very important in the early church. Those who lead need to have a solid base so as not to be pulled away, Paul says. And in our tradition, that means looking for an educated clergy. Sound teaching comes from being well educated and not flying blind. And there are parts of our immediate past, particularly in our Baptist tradition, where an educated clergy was not valued. In fact, an educated clergy was suspect because that learning is going to ruin you, right? I mean, you've heard the stories of kids who went off to college or don't let that education ruin you.
This book I'm reading also talks about that because he now is a college professor, and I think he was part of the NASA program that also went to one of the space things. I've got to do more research on what I'm reading.
Okay, let me get to my next note here. So the first qualification, someone who's blameless, is this. And this word means someone against whom you can't make a charge. Someone who could not be convicted of wrongdoing. Someone who has propriety and so forth. So that's easy. The next one's the one I want to spend some time on because this is the most controversial one here. In the NRSV it says married only once. Married only once, all right? In the Greek, what it literally says is of one wife the husband. Of one wife the husband. Or another understanding is a one-woman man. A one-woman man. Now, this...
Not, what do we call it? When they have multiple wives, it was just
polygamy.
stating that. Polygamy. Yeah.
So keep in mind, this was written in a time in which polygamy was being practiced in the culture. And one of the things that the early church is contrasting is this type of idea of being married or related to one person. A committed relationship is what we would call it today, right? Yeah. Throughout the modern church, this passage and the very same phrase is used in Timothy, right? Has focused about, well, can a divorced person be a deacon? May a divorced person be a pastor? What about a widow? What about someone who is divorced or widowed and remarries? I've told you before that during the time I worked for the Southern Baptist Home Mission Board, there was a huge debate going on about someone who remarried and what was the biblical qualification for when you could be a home missionary and when you couldn't be, because they were trying to parse it so finely that, okay, if you were in a marriage relationship and your partner was guilty of infidelity and divorced you, and you were the passive victim in the thing, then it was okay for you to be a missionary as long as you didn't remarry.
Ah.
Right? So, I mean, this is like, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin?
Right, exactly.
This is pharisaical when you get way down in it. So, in 1 Timothy 5:9, we have the very same construct that's used to say, oh, I'm sorry. there's two places in 1 Timothy, but here's the interesting thing. In 1 Timothy 5:9, there's the opposite construct, where it's referencing a one-man woman. All right? So the distinction there in, 1 Timothy 5:9 is talking about widows. The widows who can be aided by the early church, Paul says, let a widow be put on the list if she is not less than 60 years old and has been married only once. The Greek construct is the very same. Now, can you imagine Paul using that construct to say, if a woman who would have easily outlived husbands in this time, and were often married multiple times, not simultaneously, but successively, right? Can you imagine Paul saying, we're not going to help widows who've been married more than once? No. I mean, that's horrible. The other thing is, when you think about the items in this list that are given, whose children are believers, who are not accused of debauchery, not rebellious, to be blameless, a bishop, he says, to not be arrogant or quick-tempered or addicted to wine or violent or greedy for gain, to be hospitable, lover, all these good things. All of these things we would look at and measure in degrees. Because who among us, even someone as stellar as me,
Bishop,
is going to be 100% hospitable? Right? Who among us is going to be 100% a lover of goodness? Or prudent? Or upright? Or devout? Or self-controlled? These are not on-off switches. These are gradients, right? And we're looking for people who sort of fall on the high end of the gradient here. This one criteria, married only once, is the only one that historically we've tried to make an on-off switch. Why is that, Linda?
My version,
this
the
is
Message, which is always suspect, but I
the
love.
near Bible, too.
Yeah, says,
Almost.
a man, is he committed to his wife? Now that not only brings up, that kind of gets away from the whole idea of when or if, but it talks about being committed, and to me that addresses fidelity, and it addresses more than just the husband of one wife, because somebody can be the husband of one wife and then they're all committed, you know?
So Linda, you made an excellent point. It seems to me that the intent here is commitment. It is fidelity. When you read this in the context of all the other things that are here, it's about character, right? It's not about a legal status within this, right? This is about, are you in a committed kind of relationship here? Now, the big debate in our lifetime has been about, does this passage rule out women serving as deacons or pastors, right? And Wilshire dealt with this in 1991. By the way, because in 1991, there was a conversation here about, may divorced persons be ordained? May women be ordained? May single adults be ordained? In other words, because some would read this and say, well, not only do you have to be a male, but you've got to be married. And there are still a lot of churches today that won't call a single pastor because they think it's not biblical or they think it's dangerous, right? Because that single pastor is going to come carouse with all the, he'd be a danger. I don't know how that goes. So here's a fascinating bit of our Baptist history right here out of Texas. So in 1987, Bill Moyers, everyone know Bill Moyers? One of my claims to fame is that I was the director of news and information at Southwestern Seminary when I worked there, and my mother was so hopeful for me because one of the people who previously held that job was Bill Moyers. You may not know that Bill was on staff at Southwestern Seminary before he went into politics. Interesting story. So Bill Moyers, I've not achieved his level of recognition. Bill Moyers put on this hour-long TV special in 1987. Some of you may remember. I think it's called The Battle for the Bible. and it was about the Southern Baptist practice at the time, right? And it was really, really interesting. I discovered there's a complete transcript of that show on Bill Moyer's website.
Oh.
Fascinating. So at the time, I actually was in that role at Southwestern Seminary, and they came and interviewed people, so I actually got to sort of have a little connection behind the scenes to this. But one of the people he interviewed was W.A. Criswell, who at the time was pastor of First Baptist Dallas and was a staunch opponent of the ordination of women, right?
Right.
And so I'm going to read to you a little bit of this transcript because it's a great line. Bill Moyer says, "What is the biblical base for your position on the ordination of women?" And Criswell says, "Bill, let me sarcastically answer that if I could be forgiven." "I'll forgive you, but I'm not sure." Criswell says, "The scripture says, you know, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, for the bishop, the preacher, the elder is to be the husband of one wife. And I say facetiously, if a woman can be the husband of one wife, ordain her. That'll be fine. Just go ahead." And Moyer says, "Now, is that a literal reading of Scripture?" And Criswell says, "That's a literal reading of Scripture." Moyers, "Some people tell me that it's because they read the Bible to say man, man to be created and not woman was the first to fall, and woman was the first to fall, but you don't hold to that, I gather." "Oh, no," he says, "plainly, Bill, that is written in the Bible for the preacher, your pastor, is to be the husband of one wife." Moyers, "Should women not be ordained then?" Criswell, "No, sir, they should not be ordained." Moyers, "Should they not be an authority over men?" Criswell, "No." Moyers, "What should a young woman do if she sincerely believes she's been called by God to be a pastor in the Southern Baptist Convention?" Criswell, "She is mistaken. God never called her. Her own personal ambition or longing for recognition or 1,000 other things led her to that persuasion." Moyers, "What should she do? I've talked to some women who believe they have been called to be pastors." Criswell, "There are 10,000 ways that women can serve and serve effectively and beautifully. They do here in this church. The women actually run the church. There's no doubt about that. My wife, who taught a long-standing Sunday school class there, these women, gracious, alive, if I don't get along with the women, I couldn't pastor the church. I wouldn't have a church. They exert an enormous influence in it, but they ought not to be the pastor and the preacher up there in the pulpit."
Wow.
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 That's where we've come from,
Yes.
right?
That's why we
Anyone
broke
remember
away.
that show? Donna?
I remember the show. I also lived through that. I was ordained at University Baptist in 1986, and I had several, including my home church, reject me for ordination. So I lived through that time.
Yeah.
And I remember in 1987, when I first started as a prison chaplain at FCI Seagoville, I went to the local Baptist church there to ask, I needed a piano player for my worship services in the Protestant service. And the pastor there at that time was very gracious to me, met in his study, and I asked, could you have anybody play the piano, come help us out at the prison for worship service? And he said yes, and he said, I can come preach for you. And then he went off into the plan of salvation. And he literally asked me, if you die tonight, you know you're going to heaven, because I think you're not. He said that to me because I was an ordained woman, and this is a great Southern Baptist fundamentalist pastor who's still a pastor, not at that church any longer. But yeah, I've had people to ask me, I don't think you're saved.
Yeah.
It was a rough time, and I don't think the young women that we have as residents now coming through this program, they're stepping on the shoulders of people like me and Jenna and others that have gone through much suffering.
Well said. Very well said, Don. Thank you for that testimony.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that can be repeated over and over and over again. All right, I want to quote for you two non-liberal sources, because you may think Bill Moyers is out on the left edge. You may think I'm out on the left edge on this. So I want to quote two non-liberal folks who some of you will know these names. Todd Still is the dean of Truett Seminary at Baylor. He is a New Testament professor, well regarded by centrists and conservatives. Here's what he says in a paper he wrote. For my part, I find no clear or compelling biblical grounds to preclude and ample scriptural materials to support women's full and free participation in the church's ministry as God my gift and guide. That is to say, I regard those scriptural passages that silence and subordinate women in the church to be situation specific. Taken together, I find the sweep of Scripture to affirm women and to allow for their unlimited involvement in kingdom matters. Moreover, I think the trajectory of the New Testament witness is one that encourages men and women in Christ to share and serve in gospel proclamation and church administration. So what he is saying is, as a New Testament professor, look at the sweep of the story of the Bible, and you see women included, women encouraged, women called to serve in different ways. We've got to look at that, he says, rather than the very specific situations. The other thing that's behind that I'm not quoting from him and from others is, again, what does a one-woman man mean? It really is not about male in this role so much as it is about fidelity and relationship. Now, there are those who would say, but the word that's used here for elder or bishop is only ever appears as a male noun in the Greek. Okay. There are a lot of times that we use male-specific pronouns in English that mean male and female. It's sort of the default out of that. And we're struggling with that. Now, here's the other person I'm going to quote. Jim Dennison. Okay, Jim Dennison is the previous pastor at Park Cities Baptist Church. He was a philosophy PhD from Southwestern Seminary, now runs Jim is not a liberal person. No. I think, can we all agree on that? Yeah. Right? Here's what he wrote. This was in a paper presented at Park Cities Baptist Church some time ago when he was pastor. At the heart of the issue is the phrase, the husband of but one wife. When Park Cities discussed whether or not to ordain divorced men as deacons, you consider this phrase in depth. As you may recall, the Greek is best translated literally, a one wife at a time man, speaking to the issue of polygamy rather than divorce. Paul was concerned here about the public witness of deacons. In his day, divorce was tragically common and not typically seen as damaging to one's witness. But polygamy, while also common, was very destructive to Christian witness and example. And so Paul condemned polygamy for deacons, not divorce. Given that this phrase refers to polygamy, it is clear that Paul would need to apply it only to male deacons. Women were not permitted to marry more than one husband. Thus, there would be no reason for the apostle to forbid women deacons from polygamy, and so he addressed only male deacons in this regard.
So where did the ever popular Joseph Smith come up with the whole polygamy thing?
Well, that's a whole other ball of wax. Yeah, it has nothing to do with this.
I've always figured.
Yeah, that's a lesson for another day.
I worked for the Baptist General Convention of Texas for Dr. Henry Adrian, and he was in charge of when Wilshire or First Baptist or anybody who needed any sort of a hierarchy in the church, pastor or something, right, assistant pastor, he pulled resumes and sent them out. Never did he send a woman's resume.
Right.
And if the truth be known, Mark, as far as I see it, the women can be chaplains and that, but in churches they end up to be minister of children or only working with children and that. So that was a big discussion at the BGCT.
Right. And so you see the context here. At our CBF General Assembly this summer, Baptist Women in Ministry, which is an organization that is supporting, they had little buttons that people were wearing that said 3%. And the point was you were supposed to ask, 3% what?
Women.
Right, and the answer is that is the percentage of pastors in Baptist churches, in CBF churches, that are women. Mm-hmm. Right, Donna?
Yeah, I was at the beginning of the very first meeting of Baptist women and watched that organization grow from the very founding. But I want to say, you're right on about women in chaplaincy. I was endorsed in 1986 by the Home Mission Board as a chaplain at Harris Hospital. And at that time, we went to Atlanta, and there were 2 military women chaplains and myself and another hospital chaplain for endorsement proceedings that weekend. And we were told over the next 5 years, whenever we met with a Home Mission Board representative, to downplay what you do as a chaplain. Do not say that you administer the Lord's Supper. Do not say that you baptize. Do not say that you preach, which I did all of that in the prison ministry. And when the Home Mission Board would highlight chaplains in some of the magazine, the literature, they would show men doing those kind of things. The women were at the bedside holding a hand and praying. And they said, for now, yes, we think that we can still keep you endorsed. And I hung on until the CBF was accredited with the military. And once the military said we will accept CBF as endorsing agency, then I jumped ship very quickly, as many did. But it was a struggle there.
I'll end with one of my other favorite quotes on this subject. Round about that same time, there was a gentleman who I won't name his name because he's still living. He was executive director of the Florida Baptist Convention. And I heard him speak at an event once, and a Home Mission Board event. And this is exactly what he said. The problem with women being deacons is once you start ordaining women as deacons, the whole diaconate devolves into nothing but ministry.
Well, that'd be terrible.
That's a problem.
He actually said
He said that. Yeah, nothing but ministry. In other words, there's not enough authority.
Yeah.
Not enough authority there. All right, so I feel like I'm going to leave you hanging in mid-list here.
Okay.
We're going to pick up this list next week. But I knew we needed to talk about this one because this is a real stumbling block in this whole thing. What I want you to do when you leave, though, is to remember this passage is not just about this. It's about a lot of things that we're going to keep talking about, but this is one that gets pulled out and gets made bigger than all the others. And the reality is that the others are probably more important than this. And we'll get to those next week as we go. Pat?
I'm not trying to open a can of worms here, but this morning on the way home to church here, I was listening to Lover's Lane Methodist, and the guy in the pulpit was reading a letter from Don, the senior pastor at that time. He's not Don anymore, anyway. And he was talking about this thing about the statue business. And I'm still confused on that, and I'm worried about history, not other. So I'd like some opinions on that next Sunday, if we can have time.
Okay, we'll see if we can work that out. All right, so Dave, for our notes, I guess we got through, say we're going to start with verse 6. Yeah, we made it through a verse and a half today. It's a new record for me. So goodbye to everyone on the live stream. Let's talk about our prayer concern.